that become a thing, Paul? I'm sure you've gone over this a million times for your listeners, but if you could sum it up, when did we flip that narrative where it was like, hey, these things are bad? What happened in our world? Is it because we started having hamburgers and frying them in greasy vegetable oil? Like, what happened where we just went, hey, meat's bad all of a sudden?
I think that Nina Teicholz has done a really good job with this in her book, The Big Fat Surprise. I'm going to have her back on the podcast soon. Okay. But there's some history, and it's probably right around 1950 after World War II. Because if you go back to the early 1900s, I mean, you know, our great-grandparents, I mean, your great-grandparents might have been in Zimbabwe, but my great-grandparents were New York, in the United States or New Jersey. And, all the fat that we ate was from animals. There were no seed oils before 1911. I mean, cottonseed oil in the 1860s, 1870s, but Crisco 1911 was the first time we had seed oils. But, that's just one piece of the equation. But early 1900s, all the fat we ate was tallow and lard, probably from pigs that are raised way better than they're raised today, and butter. That was all the animal fat that we got. And we ate meat when we could get it. Like if you could afford meat in the early 1900s, in the Great Depression, World War I, World War II, you ate that meat. And people ate a lot less vegetables. I mean, broccoli and kale are just like inventions in the last few decades. People ate potatoes, I think, but if you look at the menus from the early 1900s, they're very different than we have today. It's a few carbs, quote unquote, of like a potato and meat. But like that's where the saying meat and potatoes came from. And then somewhere around the 1950s, I think it was Eisenhower had a heart attack. And there was a whole storm around like the narrative and, like we're going to blame this on saturated fat. And then Ansel Keys comes in and does the 7 country studies, which is totally just looks at 7 countries in the world where they could correlate saturated fat intake and heart disease and leaves out the other 16 studies, the other 16 countries where there was no association between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. So it was like this epidemiology, sleight of hand voodoo. And then there was, the American Heart Association received a huge grant, the equivalent of like $20 million plus in 1951 or something from, it was one of the food companies. It was Procter and Gamble. So Procter and Gamble gave the American Heart Association, I think it was $1 million or $1.5 million in 1950, which is the equivalent of $20 million today. And then somehow, who knows, the American Heart Association and Ansel Keys, and then the narrative completely flips on its head and says saturated fat is bad. And that's butter and milk and animal fat. And polyunsaturated fat is good. Where's that? Well, it's Crisco and corn oil. And you see these ads from the 1950s and 1960s, Mazola your family, polyunsaturate your family. We can find some of those and put them in the YouTube video. Like there's literally an ad. It's got to be 1950s, 1960s of a woman saying like, tonight I polyunsaturated my family. It's so freaking crazy, dude. So I think that has been the narrative since the 1950s. And it's all tied into the seed oils and the saturated fat. And then around that is like, the vegetables too. And vegetables are not the worst thing in the world, but it's been this sort of slow twisting of the narrative, certainly away from saturated fat. Right. And then you're away from animals. And then where do you have to go? You go to plants. And then it's like, oh, well, if you're not going to eat animals, what are you going to eat? The only thing left to eat is plants. And then we get the food pyramid with 6 servings of grains per day or more. I think it's, and like only a few, like I forget it's 6 or 12 per day. And, some of those are whole grains, but some of them are not even whole grains. Like we're being told to eat massive amounts of grains in our diets because what else is left? I mean, they've told us that red meat is bad for us. Saturated fat is bad for us. You can eat a little lean chicken and some salmon, but don't, there's nothing else left. So where are humans going to get their calories?
Right.
So it's just, I think most of it had to do with that sort of saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat argument. And then it gets really complicated when you start looking at the lipids, because then the lipid hypothesis gets tied into this and the idea that LDL cholesterol is bad for humans or is directly injurious to the endothelium. And that's a whole separate podcast that I've done, because what we find is that if you eat more saturated fat from animals and less polyunsaturated fat from seed oils or whatever, your LDL often rises 20%, 15, 20%. And if you eat more of the polyunsaturated fats, your LDL goes down. So there were famous studies done in the 1960s, the Minnesota coronary study, where they had two groups of people, and they were mental health institution patients, and they fed one of them burgers that were full of saturated fat and one of them burgers that were full of seed oils. I think it was soybean oil, and it was like 9,000 participants. And Ansel Keys was one of the people doing this study. So the guy who was kind of at the center of this transition, and his name didn't end up on the study. And the full study was never published until like 2013 by Chris Ramsden, when he went into the basement of the grandson of one of the original researchers and found the original data. But what happened was that in the people that had the seed oils in their diet, their LDL went down, but they died from cardiovascular disease more. And there was actually an increased morbidity. So they died earlier, they died sooner, and they had no protection from a cardiovascular perspective, but their LDL went down. And now we know that the whole lipid thing is more complex than just LDL. We can take the LDL and we can say, well, how much of the LDL is oxidized? How many of those phospholipids on the LDL? And then there's another subfraction of LDL called LP little a, with a lipoprotein little a on the apolipoprotein, the apolipoprotein on the LDL molecule. It's kind of like a mop. It kind of mops up oxidized phospholipids. And so what we know, the whole story, or more of the story now, is that if you eat more saturated fat and less polyunsaturated fat, your LDL may go up, but your oxidized LDL and LP little a go down. And the latter two markers are much better predictors of cardiovascular disease. So it's all wrapped up, and I apologize for the long-winded explanation, but it's this really complex, it's this complex interplay of what we consider to be healthy for the heart, cholesterol, LDL going up, the AHA potentially getting paid off. It's just really strange. And now we're at this position of trying to kind of deprogram people or say, hey, look, like this doesn't make any sense. Like there's the Hadza or these people in Papua New Guinea or, these Colombians, they're not saying, I can't eat that animal fat. That's too much saturated fat for me. My LDL is going to go up.